December 21st, 1944. Sergeant Thomas Reilly stood at the edge of a destroyed bridge and did the math. Behind him, 1,000 American soldiers were trapped on the wrong side of the Ourthe River. Ahead, German forces were closing in from 3 directions. The bridge had been demolished 2 days earlier to slow the German advance. Now it was the only escape route, and it was gone. Reilly's commanding officer had called a bridge repair a suicide mission. 3 hours exposed under the span, working on ice-covered steel within range of German positions. No engineer in their right mind would attempt it. But Reilly looked at the structural damage, calculated load-bearing requirements, and made a different calculation. 1 engineer dies maybe, 1,000 soldiers die certainly. He grabbed his tools and climbed down into the freezing river. This is the story of how one man spent 3 hours under enemy fire fixing a bridge nobody thought could be repaired, and why the Army almost court-martialed him for succeeding. Before we continue, if you want to hear more untold World War II stories about soldiers who saved lives through impossible engineering, hit subscribe. These stories don't make it into the official histories. The trap had formed gradually, then suddenly. The 7th Armored Division had been part of the American defense against the German winter offensive that history would call the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, German forces had launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, catching American units off guard and pushing them back in chaos. By December 19th, elements of the 7th Armored found themselves pushed east of the Ourthe River, a waterway that normally wasn't strategically significant, but in winter, swollen with snowmelt and freezing at the edges, it became a natural barrier. There were only 3 bridges across the Ourthe in that sector. German engineers had destroyed 2 of them to prevent American reinforcements from crossing east. The 3rd bridge, near the town of Houghton, had been demolished by American engineers themselves. It was standard defensive doctrine. When retreating, destroy infrastructure behind you to slow enemy pursuit. The engineers who blew the bridge assumed all American forces were already on the west side of the river. They were wrong. 1,000 soldiers from various units had been cut off during the confused retreat. Infantry, artillery crews, support personnel, even a few tank destroyers that had run out of fuel. They'd all ended up on the wrong side of the river, grouped together by necessity rather than organization. And with the bridge gone, they had no way back. The German forces closing in weren't trying to capture them. Capture required logistics, guards, processing. The Germans were stretched thin, their offensive running on fumes and desperation. They wanted the Americans eliminated, not captured, which meant the 1,000 trapped soldiers had 2 options: fight until they ran out of ammunition or attempt to cross a freezing river that would kill them just as effectively as German bullets. Command had run the calculations. A rescue assault would require significant forces crossing terrain the Germans now controlled. Best estimates suggested 500 casualties to save 1,000 trapped men. Those weren't acceptable numbers, not when the entire American line was under pressure, not when every available soldier was needed elsewhere. The official order was grim but clear. The trapped force would hold position as long as possible, then surrender if necessary. It was the coldest type of military mathematics. Sometimes you couldn't save everyone. Thomas Reilly was not supposed to be there. He was a combat engineer attached to a different division entirely, but chaos had a way of mixing units together. He'd been escorting a supply convoy when German forces cut the road. Instead of fighting back west, he'd moved east with other retreating units and ended up trapped with everyone else. Reilly was 32, older than most sergeants. Before the war, he'd been a bridge inspector for the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. His job involved climbing under bridges, examining steel supports, calculating load tolerances, determining whether structures needed repair or replacement. He'd spent 10 years doing that work in all weather, on bridges of every type. The Army had recognized his skill set and trained him as a combat engineer, building field fortifications, clearing obstacles, demolishing bridges to slow enemy advance. The irony wasn't lost on Reilly that he now destroyed the same types of structures he used to maintain. But the training went both ways. If you knew how to destroy a bridge efficiently, you understood its structural vulnerabilities. And if you understood vulnerabilities, you understood what held bridges together in the first place. On the morning of December 21st, while other trapped soldiers fortified positions and rationed ammunition, Reilly walked to the destroyed bridge and studied it with a professional eye. Not the eye of a soldier looking at an obstacle, but the eye of a bridge inspector looking at a maintenance problem. The bridge had been a standard steel truss design, probably built in the 1920s. 2 stone pylons supporting steel framework spanning 120 feet across the river. American engineers had demolished it by placing charges on the center span. The explosion had been effective. The middle section had collapsed into the river, taking most of the roadway with it, but the explosion had been designed for speed, not thoroughness. The pylons were intact. The approach spans on both sides remained structurally sound. And most importantly, the steel support trusses, though twisted and damaged, were still anchored to the pylons. Reilly stood there for 20 minutes, studying angles and calculating in his head load-bearing capacity, stress distribution, material strength. He wasn't thinking about combat or Germans or the 1,000 trapped men behind him. He was thinking about whether a bridge could be fixed. The answer, professionally speaking, was maybe. The answer, practically speaking, was probably not. The answer, mathematically speaking, was that it didn't matter whether it could be fixed if nobody tried. Reilly walked back to find whoever was in command of this improvised trapped force. He found a captain from the 7th Armored organizing defensive positions. The captain looked exhausted, the kind of tired that came from knowing your men were dead and just waiting for the formality. "Sir," Reilly said, "that bridge, I think I can fix it." The captain stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon. "Fix it?" "Temporary repair, enough to get men across, 3 hours of work, maybe 4. "Sergeant, that bridge is destroyed. The center span is in the river." "Yes, sir. But the supports are intact. I can cable across, reinforce the framework, create a temporary walkway. Won't handle vehicles, but men can cross single file." The captain's expression shifted from disbelief to something more complicated. Hope mixed with skepticism, mixed with the terrible burden of command. "How exposed would you be?" "Completely, sir. I'd be working under the bridge, visible from German positions across the river. 3 to 4 hours of exposure." "That's suicide." "Yes, sir." "Probably." Reilly kept his voice level, factual. "But 1,000 men are trapped. If I don't try, they're dead. If I try and fail, they're still dead, plus I'm dead. If I try and succeed, everyone lives. The math seems clear." The captain looked at Reilly for a long moment, then at the destroyed bridge, then back at Reilly. "I can't order you to do this." "No, sir, but you can't order me not to either." That was about to be tested. The captain studied Reilly with the expression of a man weighing impossible choices. Around them, soldiers dug defensive positions in frozen ground, preparing for a battle everyone knew they'd lose. The sound of distant German artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. "Even if I wanted to authorize this," the captain said slowly, "I don't have the authority. Bridge repair during active combat requires engineering corps approval. That approval comes from division, and division is 20 miles away with Germans between us and them." Reilly had expected this. The military ran on authorization chains for good reason. Random sergeants didn't get to make strategic infrastructure decisions just because they had an idea. But authorization chains required communication, time, and a chain of command that wasn't cut off and surrounded. "Sir, with respect, by the time we request and receive authorization, the Germans will have overrun this position. We have maybe 6 hours before they close the trap completely." The captain nodded grimly. He knew the timeline as well as Reilly did. German reconnaissance had been probing their perimeter since dawn. It was only a matter of time before a full assault came. "What do you need?" "Cable, welding equipment, 2 volunteers who aren't afraid of heights or Germans, and everyone else to keep the Germans busy enough that they don't focus on one engineer hanging under a bridge. The moment you start making noise under there, every German position with a sight line will know exactly where you are." "Yes, sir." "They'll shoot at you." Probably, sir. The captain looked past Reilly at the destroyed bridge, then at the 1,000 men scattered across the defensive perimeter. Men who'd followed orders, fought hard, and were now trapped because bridges got demolished faster than situations changed. I can't order you to do this, Sergeant, but I won't order you not to. It was the closest thing to authorization Reilly was going to get. He spent the next hour gathering equipment and volunteers. The welding gear came from a disabled tank destroyer that had been carrying repair equipment. The cable came from a supply truck. Finding volunteers was harder. Most soldiers looked at the destroyed bridge, looked at German positions across the river, and politely declined the opportunity to get shot while doing construction work. 2 men stepped forward anyway. Private First Class Marcus Webb, a machinist from Detroit who understood metalwork, and Corporal James Patterson, a former iron worker from Chicago who'd spent years on high-rise construction. Neither man explained why they volunteered. They just picked up tools and followed Reilly to the riverbank. Reilly briefed them on the plan as they prepared equipment. The center span was gone, collapsed into the river, but the support framework on both sides remained partially intact. They'd run steel cable across the gap, anchor it to the undamaged sections, then build a temporary walkway using salvaged planking. The structure wouldn't be pretty and it wouldn't last long, but it didn't need to. It just needed to hold weight for maybe 2 hours while 1,000 men crossed single file. How much weight can cable support? Webb asked, examining the steel line they'd scavenged. This gauge, properly anchored, about 10 tons working load, Reilly calculated in his head. Average soldier with equipment weighs maybe 200 pounds. We space them 20 feet apart, that's maybe a dozen men on the span at once. 2,400 pounds, well within tolerance. That's assuming the anchors hold, Patterson pointed out. That's assuming everything holds, Reilly agreed. The anchors, the cable, the walkway, our luck. Any one thing fails, men die. Patterson nodded slowly. And if we don't try, everyone dies. They started work at 1,100 hours. Reilly climbed down to the riverbank first, finding the best approach to the damaged structure. The Ourthe wasn't particularly wide or deep, but in December it was freezing and fast-moving. Fall in, and hypothermia would kill you within minutes, even if you didn't drown first. The bridge supports descended into the water at an angle. Reilly secured rope to the intact western approach, tied himself off, and began climbing out over the river toward the damaged center section. Behind him, Webb and Patterson followed with equipment. The steel was ice-covered and treacherous. Every handhold required clearing frost before gripping. The bridge creaked under their weight, damaged metal groaning in protest. Reilly tried not to think about the fact that he was hanging 30 feet above freezing water on a structure that had been deliberately exploded. He focused on the engineering instead. The support trusses were twisted, but not severed. The main load-bearing members showed damage but retained structural integrity. The connections to the stone pylons were solid. This could work. It would be ugly and temporary, but it could work. They reached the gap where the center span had fallen away, 40 feet of empty air between the western and eastern sections. Reilly examined the framework on the eastern side through binoculars. The metal looked sound. The anchoring points appeared intact. We're going to throw cable across, he told Webb and Patterson. Anchor both ends, tension it, then use it as framework for the walkway. Patterson, you're the lightest. You'll cross first to secure the far end. Patterson looked at the 40-foot gap of open air and freezing river below. You want me to cross on just cable, before there's a walkway? Someone has to secure the far end before we can build the walkway. That someone needs to be light enough not to stress the cable before it's properly anchored. How do I cross? Carefully. Reilly demonstrated the technique. Hang beneath the cable, move hand over hand, don't look down, don't think about falling. Basic rope traverse that they'd all learned in training. Except training had been over solid ground, not freezing water, and training hadn't included German soldiers occasionally shooting at you. Patterson stared at the gap for a long moment, then nodded. Let's do it before I think too hard about it. They rigged the first cable throw. Reilly tied one end to the western framework, weighted the other end, and hurled it across the gap. The cable arced through cold air and clanged against steel on the far side. It took 3 tries before they managed to hook it properly on the eastern framework. Webb secured the western end to a support truss, checking and double-checking the anchoring. They tensioned the cable until it hung as straight as they could manage. It wasn't perfect, but perfect wasn't an option. Patterson took off his gloves despite the cold. Bare hands gripped better than frozen fabric. He positioned himself beneath the cable, gripped tight, and began moving hand over hand across the void. That's when the first German shot rang out. The bullet pinged off steel framework 6 feet from Patterson's position. He froze mid-traverse, hanging beneath the cable over freezing water. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then another shot, this one closer. "Keep moving," Reilly called. "They're ranging. Don't give them a stationary target." Patterson resumed his hand-over-hand crossing, moving faster now despite the danger of slipping. More shots rang out, echoing across the river valley. The Germans had spotted movement under the bridge and were trying to determine what was happening. Their fire was exploratory rather than concentrated, but that would change once they understood what the Americans were attempting. Patterson reached the eastern side, swung himself onto solid framework, and secured the cable end to a support truss. He tested the tension, found it acceptable, and signaled back to Reilly. The first connection was complete. They needed 4 more cables to create a stable framework. Each one required the same process: throw, hook, tension, secure. Webb and Patterson worked methodically despite occasional gunfire that sparked off metal around them. The Germans across the river were maybe 800 yards distant, too far for accurate rifle fire, but close enough to make every minute feel dangerous. Reilly ignored the shooting and focused on engineering. Cable spacing needed to be precise. Too narrow and the walkway would be unstable. Too wide and soldiers crossing wouldn't have adequate handholds. He calculated 18-inch spacing, marked positions on the framework, and directed the placement of each line. By noon, 5 cables were rigged and tensioned. The framework was ready. Now came the harder part: creating an actual surface soldiers could walk on. They'd salvaged wooden planking from destroyed buildings near the river. The planks were rough, uneven, barely adequate, but adequate was enough. Reilly measured and cut, creating sections that could be laid across the cable framework. Each section needed to be light enough to maneuver into position, but strong enough to support human weight. He settled on 8-foot lengths, each one secured with wire to the cables beneath. The work required all 3 men positioned at different points under the bridge: Reilly on the western side, Patterson on the eastern side, Webb in the middle section hanging above the river. They communicated through hand signals and occasional shouted instructions when hammer noise drowned out other sound. German fire intensified around 1300 hours. Someone across the river had finally understood what was happening and called in more attention. Machine gun fire raked the bridge supports. Bullets sparked off steel. One round passed close enough to Reilly's head that he felt the air displacement. Webb took a fragment of shrapnel across his left shoulder. Nothing serious, just a graze that bled through his uniform. He wrapped it quickly and kept working. They couldn't stop now. Every minute brought the German assault closer. The defensive perimeter was already showing signs of pressure. Artillery had started falling on the trapped American positions. The trap was closing. They laid planks across the framework, working from both ends toward the middle. The walkway began taking shape. Rough, narrow, swaying slightly with every movement, but functional. Soldiers could cross this. Maybe not quickly, maybe not comfortably, but they could cross. By 1400 hours, the walkway was 3/4 complete. 20 feet of gap remained in the center, the most difficult section where cable sag was worst and framework weakest. Reilly examined the problem, calculating weight distribution and stress points. "We need diagonal bracing," he told Webb. 2 more cables running at angles to stabilize the center section. "That's not in any bridge manual I know," Webb replied. "No, but manuals don't usually cover emergency repairs under machine gun fire." They rigged the diagonal cables, improvising as they went. The solution was inelegant but effective. The center section stabilized. The walkway could be completed. At 1425 hours, Patterson secured the final plank. The temporary bridge was finished. 3 hours and 25 minutes of work. Reilly climbed back to the western bank, soaking wet from spray and sweat despite freezing temperatures, and reported to the captain. "It's ready, sir. Single file only. Spacemen 20 feet apart. No running. The structure will hold if we're careful." The captain looked at the improvised walkway, then at Reilly. "Sergeant, that's the most terrifying bridge I've ever seen." "Yes, sir, but it works." The captain nodded and began organizing the crossing. The evacuation began at 14:30 hours. The captain organized soldiers into groups of 50, spacing them strategically. Infantry first, carrying only essential weapons and ammunition, then artillery crews without their guns, support personnel, walking wounded. Anyone who could cross under their own power went immediately. Those who needed assistance would come later with help. The first soldier stepped onto the improvised walkway. Every eye in the trapped force watched him take those initial steps. The planks shifted slightly under his weight. The cables creaked, but the structure held. He moved forward carefully, testing each step, hands gripping the makeshift railings Reilly had rigged from spare cable. 20 feet behind him, the second soldier began crossing, then the third. The system worked. Slow, careful, one man at a time, moving across 40 feet of emergency engineering suspended over freezing water. Reilly stood at the western end, watching every crossing with professional anxiety. He'd calculated the tolerances. He knew the structure should hold, but should and would were different concepts when 1,000 lives depended on mathematics done in your head under combat conditions. The bridge swayed with each crossing. Not dramatically, just enough movement to remind everyone that this wasn't a permanent structure. The soldiers felt it. Some moved faster, wanting off the unstable surface as quickly as possible. Others froze momentarily, gripping cables until they gathered courage to continue. Reilly stopped anyone who tried to rush. "Slow and steady. The bridge holds if you don't stress it. Panic kills." German fire continued throughout the crossing. Machine gun rounds sparked off framework. Rifle shots kicked up water below the bridge. One soldier took a round through his pack, the bullet passing through spare clothing without hitting flesh. He kept walking. By 1500 hours, 200 men had crossed. The structure showed strain but remained functional. Reilly inspected the cable anchors regularly, checking for slippage or stress failure. So far, everything held within acceptable parameters. The German assault on the defensive perimeter intensified. Artillery fire walked through American positions. Infantry probes tested multiple points. The trap was closing faster than anticipated. The captain accelerated the evacuation schedule, reducing spacing between crossers from 20 feet to 15. Reilly objected. "Sir, that increases load stress beyond calculated tolerance." "Noted, Sergeant, but if we don't speed up, the Germans will overrun us before everyone crosses." It was another impossible calculation. Safety versus time. Engineering versus tactics. Reilly had no good answer, so he said nothing and watched his bridge carry more weight than he'd designed it for. At 15:45 hours, disaster nearly struck. A soldier panicked midway across, freezing in place and gripping the cables. The man behind him stopped, creating a clustering of weight on the center section. The walkway sagged noticeably. Cables groaned under stress. Webb, still positioned under the bridge making continuous repairs, called up a warning. "Sergeant, center anchors are slipping. Too much weight concentrated." Reilly moved onto the bridge himself, talking the frozen soldier forward with calm authority. "Eyes on me. Not on the water. Just walk toward my voice. 3 more steps. That's good. Keep coming." The soldier moved, the weight distributed, the cables stabilized, crisis averted. By 16:30 hours, 700 men had crossed. 300 remained on the eastern bank. The defensive perimeter was collapsing. German forces had breached the northern section. American soldiers fell back toward the bridge in fighting retreat, providing covering fire for those still crossing. The captain stood at the western end, directing traffic, refusing to cross until every man under his command was safe. Reilly worked alongside him, monitoring structural integrity, making emergency adjustments when cables showed excessive wear. At 1700 hours, the last infantry unit began crossing under fire. German machine guns had range on the bridge now. Bullets hit planking, splintered wood. severed one of the diagonal support cables Reilly had rigged. The walkway tilted slightly but held. 50 men remained, then 40, then 30. Artillery began falling near the bridge approaches. The Germans understood this was the escape route and were trying to destroy it or make it unusable. Shells hit water near the pylons, sending up geysers that soaked the structure and everyone on it. 20 men. Crossing faster now, caution abandoned for speed. 10 men. The captain went next to last, sprinting across planking that swayed wildly under his rushed movement. The final soldier was a medic who'd been treating wounded until the last possible moment. He stepped onto the bridge as German infantry appeared on the eastern bank. Rifle fire followed him across. He ran, slipped, caught himself, kept moving. He reached the western bank at 17:18 hours. 1,000 men had crossed, 0 casualties during the evacuation. Reilly looked at his bridge, still standing, still functional despite everything it had endured. Then, he pulled the quick release he'd built into the western anchors. The cables went slack. The structure collapsed into the Ourthe River with a sound like thunder. The Germans would get no use from his engineering. The 1,000 soldiers regrouped 2 miles west of the river, exhausted, cold, alive. Medical teams treated minor wounds and hypothermia cases. Supply units distributed hot coffee and rations. Nobody quite believed they'd escaped. Reilly sat on a supply crate, drinking coffee that tasted like mud and motor oil. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline crash. Webb had his shoulder properly bandaged. Patterson was explaining to anyone who'd listened exactly how terrifying it felt to hang beneath a cable while Germans shot at you. An hour later, a jeep arrived carrying a colonel from Division Engineering. The colonel walked directly to Reilly, studied him for a long moment, then spoke one word. "Explain," Reilly explained. The bridge damage assessment, the intact supports, the cable framework, the calculated weight tolerances, the 3-hour construction timeline, the 1,000 soldiers who crossed successfully. The deliberate demolition after evacuation was complete. The colonel listened without interrupting. When Reilly finished, the silence stretched uncomfortable and long. "Sergeant Reilly, you conducted a major engineering operation without authorization, during active combat, under enemy fire, using improvised methods not covered by any field manual." "Yes, sir." "You risked your life and the lives of 2 volunteers on a structure that had no safety margin and no backup plan." "Yes, sir." "You deliberately disobeyed a direct order from your commanding officer who told you this operation was not feasible." Reilly paused. "Sir, the captain said he couldn't order me to do it. That's different from ordering me not to." The colonel's expression suggested he didn't appreciate the distinction. "You put yourself in a position where German forces had direct line of sight to you for 3 hours. You were completely exposed. One lucky shot would have killed you and potentially stranded everyone still on the eastern bank." "Yes, sir." But the math still worked. 1 engineer at risk versus 1,000 soldiers certain to die. The calculation seemed clear. The colonel's voice was flat. "Sergeant, warfare is not a mathematics problem." "With respect, sir, engineering is exactly a mathematics problem. I calculated load tolerances, stress distributions, and probability of structural failure. The bridge held because the math was sound." The colonel walked away, conferred quietly with the captain who'd commanded the trapped force, then returned. "Your commanding officer states that you saved 1,000 lives through exceptional initiative and engineering skill under impossible conditions. He's recommending you for the Silver Star." Reilly said nothing. "I'm denying that recommendation." Reilly nodded. He'd expected this. "What you did was reckless, unauthorized, and outside all established protocol. If I commend you officially, every combat engineer in this army will think they can make independent tactical decisions without oversight. That's how soldiers die." "Yes, sir. However," the colonel's tone shifted slightly, "what you did also worked. 1,000 men are alive because you refused to accept an impossible situation as final. That matters." The compromise was bureaucratic and invisible. No medal, no commendation, but also no reprimand, no court-martial. The official record would state that the trapped force successfully evacuated across a damaged bridge using field-expedient engineering methods. Reilly's name would appear nowhere in the report. Understood, sir. One more thing, Sergeant. Where did you learn to build a bridge in 3 hours under machine gun fire? Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, sir. Bridge Inspection Division. You'd be surprised what you learn hanging under bridges all day. The colonel almost smiled. Almost. Dismissed. Reilly returned to his unit that evening. Word had spread about the bridge. Soldiers thanked him quietly, awkwardly, not quite knowing how to express gratitude for continued existence. Reilly accepted their thanks with uncomfortable brevity and tried to focus on normal duties. Webb found him 3 days later. Sergeant, I've been thinking about that bridge design. The diagonal bracing solution you came up with, that's not in any manual, but it worked perfectly. You should write it up, submit it to Engineering Corps. No. Why not? Reilly looked at Webb. Because I don't want every engineer thinking they should work under fire. The bridge worked because we were lucky as much as skilled. Luck runs out. But 1,000 men are alive. That's enough. I don't need credit for doing what needed doing. That became Reilly's standard response whenever anyone brought up the bridge. It needed doing. He did it. Move on. The war continued. Reilly returned to normal combat engineering duties, building fortifications, clearing obstacles, occasionally demolishing bridges instead of repairing them. He never attempted another emergency bridge repair under fire. The opportunity never arose, and he didn't seek it out. The 1,000 soldiers scattered across different units as the war progressed. Most never learned the name of the engineer who'd saved them. They just knew someone had built a bridge when bridges were impossible, and that made all the difference. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Thomas Reilly was in Germany when the announcement came, part of an engineering battalion rebuilding infrastructure the retreating German army had destroyed. He listened to the news, felt relief more than joy, and went back to work. Bridges still needed building whether the war was over or not. The army discharged him in September. Standard paperwork, a handshake from a major who'd never heard of the Ourthe River Bridge, and a train ticket to Pittsburgh. Reilly carried his duffel bag, his discharge papers, and memories of 3 hours hanging over freezing water that he had no intention of discussing with anyone. He returned to his old job with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. Bridge inspection. The same work he'd done before the war, examining steel structures for stress damage and calculating remaining service life. His supervisors welcomed him back. His coworkers asked about Europe. Reilly said it was cold and muddy and he was glad to be home. That was the extent of his war stories. He married in 1947 a woman named Dorothy who worked at the county assessor's office. They bought a small house in Brookline with money Reilly had saved, had 3 children, lived quietly, fixed things around the house, went to work every day and came home every evening. The bridge stayed locked in his memory, not haunting him, just residing there like a technical problem he'd solved under unusual circumstances. He thought about it sometimes when inspecting old steel structures, wondered if his emergency repairs had used the same principles, wondered if other engineers ever faced similar impossible choices. If this story showed you a side of World War II you never knew existed, hit subscribe. Because the soldiers who saved the most lives rarely got the recognition. Dorothy asked about the war exactly once, early in their marriage. Did you do anything dangerous? Same as everyone. Followed orders, came home. Brained? She didn't press. Most veterans didn't talk, and their families learned not to ask. In 1968, Thomas Reilly was inspecting a bridge outside McKeesport when a man approached him, older, maybe 60, walking with a slight limp. The man studied Reilly's face for a long moment. You're Thomas Reilly, combat engineer, 7th Armored Sector, December 1944. Reilly lowered his clipboard. I am. I was there, at the Ourthe River, crossed your bridge. The man extended his hand. Captain Morrison, I commanded that trapped force. They shook hands. Morrison's grip was firm despite age. I've been trying to find you for 20 years, Morrison said. To say thank you. You saved my life and 1,000 others. Nobody ever knew your name. It wasn't in any report. That was intentional. I figured. Morrison smiled slightly. Still, you should know those men had families, children, grandchildren now. You saved all of them too, in a way. Reilly nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. I just fixed a bridge. You did more than that. No, I calculated weight tolerance, rigged cables, laid planking. Basic engineering. Anyone with the same training could have done it. But nobody else did. You did. They talked for 20 minutes. Morrison shared what had happened to various soldiers from that trapped force. Many had survived the war, gone home, built lives. Several had become engineers themselves, inspired by what they had witnessed that day. Reilly listened and felt something shift. Not pride exactly, more like quiet satisfaction that the mathematics had worked out correctly in the long term as well as the short term. Morrison left eventually. Reilly returned to his bridge inspection, but that evening he told Dorothy about the Ourthe River. Not in detail, just the outline. A bridge that needed fixing. 1,000 men who needed crossing. 3 hours of work that mattered. Dorothy listened and said, "You never mentioned saving 1,000 lives." Didn't seem relevant to selling hardware or raising children. It's relevant to who you are. Reilly considered that. Maybe, but I'm just an engineer who understands steel and weight distribution. The bridge was a problem. I solved it. Thomas Reilly died in 1979 at age 67. Heart failure, quick and painless. His obituary mentioned he was a World War II veteran and a retired bridge inspector. Nothing about the Ourthe River. Nothing about 1,000 lives. His family found a small wooden box in his desk. Inside was a piece of steel cable, 6 inches long, worn smooth. A note attached in his handwriting, Ourthe River, December 21st, 1944. Calculated tolerance, 10 tons. Actual load, 200,000 pounds. Math worked. That was the only record Thomas Reilly kept of the day he refused to accept that 1,000 men were already dead. Sometimes the most important engineering isn't about building permanent structures. Sometimes it's about building something temporary that holds just long enough for everyone to survive.